In the luxury cabin of a private jet 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, a brilliant investment banker was about to receive the call that would destroy everything she'd built. What started as reviewing merger documents for the biggest deal of her career took a shocking turn when she came face to face with systematic betrayal from those she trusted most. Madison Crawford wasn't your typical Wall Street executive. For 18 months, she had spent her life orchestrating a $1.3 billion international merger, known for her photographic memory and ability to read people's true motivations, skills, honed from navigating the complex social dynamics of Appalachian poverty. When she encountered her mentor's voice delivering news of her termination, she had no idea she was walking into a web of international conspiracy and financial crime. Crawford's response, refusing to accept defeat and methodically uncovering the truth, would lead to exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of global finance. What began as a career-ending betrayal would become a battle for justice that spanned 3 continents. The investment banking industry would never be the same after this girl from Kentucky's mountains proved that integrity could triumph over institutional corruption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, Madison. Crawford spread the final merger documents across the polished mahogany table of Blackstone and Associates' private jet. The papers represented 18 months of her life, every late night, every cross-continental flight, every carefully orchestrated phone call that had brought 5 companies across 3 continents to the brink of a $1.3 billion union. Her fingers traced the signature lines where tomorrow's meetings would seal the largest deal of her career. The cabin's soft lighting cast shadows across rows of financial projections. Each number burned into her memory with the precision that had made her Wall Street's youngest female VP from rural America. She could recite the quarterly earnings of Priya Sharma's sustainable tech company, the energy reserves of Dmitry Volkov's Russian operations, the manufacturing capacity of the Japanese consortium, all of it stored in the same mind that once memorized every face in the Hazard County courthouse where her grandmother cleaned floors. Maddie allowed herself a rare smile. Tomorrow, she would stand in boardrooms in London, Dubai, Singapore, and Tokyo, watching her clients sign documents that would transform their companies and secure thousands of jobs. The girl from the Kentucky mountains would have orchestrated one of the most complex international mergers in recent history. The satellite phone's harsh ring shattered her reverie. Ms. Crawford? The voice belonged to Janet Mitchell, Blackstone's HR director, professional, clipped. The tone that preceded life-changing announcements. I need to inform you that effective immediately, your employment with Blackstone and Associates has been terminated. The words hit like physical blows. Maddie's hand stilled on the documents, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of what she'd just heard. I'm sorry, what? Your corporate access has been revoked, and all pending transactions under your supervision have been suspended. You'll need to return company property, including the merger files you have with you. The jet's engines hummed steadily, but Maddie felt the ground disappearing beneath her feet faster than any turbulence could manage. Janet, there's obviously been some mistake. I'm in the middle of closing the Prometheus deal. 5 companies are counting on. There's no mistake, Ms. Crawford. The decision comes from the highest levels of management. The line went dead. Maddie stared at the phone, her reflection caught in its dark screen. The face looking back showed the exhaustion of months of preparation, but also something else. The sharp alertness that came from growing up poor, where survival meant reading the subtle signs that adults thought children missed. Her phone buzzed. Again. Marcus Chen. Madison. Her former mentor's voice carried the smooth authority that had once made her feel protected, guided. Now it felt like ice water in her veins. I'm sure Janet's call came as a shock. Marcus, what the hell is going on? The Prometheus deal is scheduled to close. Was scheduled. he corrected gently. I'm afraid there have been some irregularities discovered in your documentation. Questions about compliance, potential conflicts of interest. The board felt immediate action was necessary. Irregularities. The word hung in the recycled air of the cabin like a toxin. Maddie's mind raced through every document, every filing, every conversation. Her photographic memory found nothing, no missed detail, no oversight, which meant this wasn't about compliance. That's impossible, and you know it. My documentation is flawless. Every filing has been vetted by legal, by risk management. Nevertheless, the decision stands. I'm sorry, Madison. Truly. You showed such promise. The condescension in those final words ignited something primal in Maddie's chest. She heard her grandmother's voice from a decade ago. Baby girl, when folks start talking about what you could have been, they're usually the ones who made sure you never got the chance. The company jet will divert to London, Marcus continued. You'll transfer to commercial aviation for your return to New York. I'm sure you understand. Liability concerns. The line went dead, leaving Maddie alone with the documents that now felt like evidence of her own naivety. She tried calling Dmitry Volkov's London office, her fingers moving automatically through the number sequence. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried Sheikh Al-Rashid in Dubai. Same result. Yamamoto Industries in Tokyo. The pattern became clear with sick certainty. Her access to her clients had been severed as efficiently as her employment. Through the jet's oval window, clouds stretched endlessly below, their surfaces deceptively calm. It reminded her of the morning mist that used to roll through the Kentucky hollows, hiding the sharp rocks and sudden drops that could kill the unwary. She'd learned early that the most dangerous terrain often looked the most peaceful. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. Ms. Crawford, we've received instructions to divert to London Heathrow. We'll be landing in approximately 3 hours. 3 hours. Somewhere below, her professional life was being dismantled with surgical precision. 5 companies representing thousands of employees were being left to wonder why their merger had suddenly evaporated, and she was trapped in a metal tube above the Atlantic, cut off from everything she'd spent 18 months building. But as the initial shock gave way to something colder and more calculating, Maddie felt the survival instincts that had carried her from Appalachian poverty to Wall Street's heights begin to engage. This wasn't random corporate politics. Timing was too precise, the coordination too complete. Someone had orchestrated this destruction with the same meticulous planning she'd used to build the deal. Her fingers moved across her personal phone, checking encrypted messages from Sarah Kim, her former assistant who'd transferred to the tech analysis division 6 months ago. Nothing recent, but Sarah had always been more observant than people realized. If there were digital breadcrumbs leading to whoever had done this, Sarah would know how to find them. The jet banked slightly, adjusting course for London, and Maddie watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. In her grandmother's trailer in Hazard, it would be mid-afternoon. The old woman would be sitting on the porch with her coffee, watching the mountains that had sheltered generations of Crawfords who'd learned to fight for everything they ever got. Maddie Crawford had clawed her way from those mountains to the top of global finance. Someone had just made the mistake of thinking they could send her back without a fight. As London grew closer, she began planning her counterattack. The wheels of the corporate jet touched down at Heathrow with a finality that echoed through Maddie's chest. As London's gray morning light filtered through the terminal windows, she found herself standing at the customs line with nothing but her personal luggage and a head full of questions that multiplied with each passing hour. Her corporate credit cards had been frozen. She'd discovered that humiliating fact when trying to book a hotel room. The Ritz, where Blackstone always housed its executives, suddenly had no record of her reservation. Even the Marriott downtown required her personal Amex, a card she rarely used because company policy covered all business travel expenses. The modest boutique hotel in Bloomsbury, where she finally found a room, felt like stepping through a looking glass into an alternate reality. The floral wallpaper and creaking floors stood in stark contrast to the sleek corporate towers where she'd spent the last decade of her life. But something about the worn comfort reminded her of her grandmother's trailer. Functional, honest, without pretense. Sitting on the narrow bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, Maddie opened an encrypted messaging app that Sarah Kim had insisted all the junior staff install months ago. For sensitive client communications, Sarah had explained, though Maddie suspected her former assistant's paranoia about corporate surveillance ran deeper than most people realized. The message indicator showed 3 unread communications from Sarah, timestamped throughout the night. Something's wrong. Chen called emergency meeting this morning. All your files requisitioned by legal. S update. Bobby Castellano personally oversaw removal of your office contents. Risk management claiming potential compliance violations. This doesn't feel routine. S urgent. Intercepted internal email chain. Your termination was planned weeks ago. They've been building a case. Need to talk. Use the secure line. Maddie's blood chilled as she read the final message. Weeks ago, while she'd been burning the midnight oil in Tokyo, finalizing details. With Yamamoto Industries, someone at Blackstone had been systematically building her professional grave. She dialed the secure number Sarah had provided, grateful for her former assistant's technological paranoia. The phone rang twice before Sarah's familiar voice answered, tight with worry. Maddie? Jesus, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Where are you? London. Stranded and apparently unemployed. Maddie kept her voice level, but the anger underneath felt like molten steel. Tell me about these emails. I've been monitoring the senior staff communications since Marcus started acting weird 3 weeks ago. You know how he always CCs everyone on routine stuff? Suddenly, he was having private conversations with Bobby, with the legal team, even with some of the board members. That's not his style. Sarah was right. Marcus Chen was a master of corporate theater, the kind of executive who made sure his every decision had an audience. Private machinations suggested something far more sinister than routine personnel decisions. What kind of case were they building? Maddie asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be devastating. Compliance violations, conflict of interest allegations, questions about your client relationships. They've been going through your communications, your expense, reports, even your meeting schedules, looking for anything that could be twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. The methodical nature of the investigation sent ice through Maddie's veins. This wasn't Marcus protecting himself from a rival's success. This was character assassination, planned with surgical precision. Someone wanted to ensure that when they destroyed her, she'd have no credibility left to fight back. Sarah, I need you to be very careful. If they're willing to destroy my career, they won't hesitate to come after anyone helping me. I know the risks. Sarah's voice carried a steel that reminded Maddie why she'd trusted her with the most sensitive aspects of her work. But I also know you, and I know this is bullshit. You're the most ethical person at that entire firm. The loyalty in those words hit Maddie harder than she'd expected. In the cutthroat world of investment banking, genuine loyalty was rarer than perfect, quarterly projections. That Sarah was willing to risk her own career spoke to something that transcended professional relationships. I need everything you can find, Maddie said. Internal communications, meeting schedules, any evidence of when this conspiracy started. And Sarah, be smart about it. Don't access anything that could be traced back to you directly. Already, on it. I've been building a backup archive of all your project files, including the Prometheus documentation. If they think they can bury this deal, they're going to have to explain why $1, $3 billion worth of perfectly legitimate mergers suddenly became radioactive the moment you were removed. After ending the call, Maddie sat in the hotel room's silence, processing the magnitude of what she was facing. This wasn't just termination, it was professional assassination. Someone had invested weeks of planning to ensure her destruction would be complete and irreversible. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an international number she recognized immediately, Dmitry Volkov. Her pulse quickened as she answered. "Ms. Crawford." The Russian's voice carried its characteristic gruffness, but underneath she detected something unexpected, concern. "I have been trying to reach you since yesterday. Mr. Volkov, I'm sure you've heard about my situation with Blackstone. I want to assure you that despite these developments, the Prometheus deal can still move forward." "Stop." His interruption was sharp but not unkind. "I am not calling about business. I am calling because what happened to you smells like betrayal, and I know this smell very well." The unexpected empathy in his voice caught Maddie off guard. In all their months of negotiations, Dmitry had been professional but distant, the kind of client who evaluated everything through the lens of profit and loss. This sounded like something else entirely. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm confident this misunderstanding will be resolved quickly." "Misunderstanding?" Dmitry's laugh was harsh. "Child, I built my empire from nothing after Soviet Union collapsed. I lost everything once because I trusted wrong people, because I believed that competence and integrity were enough. Let me tell you what I learned. When powerful men destroy talented women systematically, is never misunderstanding, is always fear." His words resonated with something deep in Maddie's chest. The deliberate nature of her destruction, the careful timing, the preemptive strikes against her credibility, it did smell like fear. But fear of what? "Mr. Volkov, you come to London, yes? Good. We meet tomorrow morning. I have offices in Canary Wharf. We discuss not just your situation, but why someone was so frightened of your success that they risked destroying billion-dollar deal to stop you." The line went dead, leaving Maddie staring at her phone with a mixture of hope and apprehension. In the span of an hour, she'd gone from completely isolated to having two allies willing to risk their own positions to help her. But she'd also confirmed that her destruction had been orchestrated with a level of sophistication that suggested resources and planning far beyond what she'd initially imagined. Outside her hotel window, London's afternoon traffic flowed with relentless purpose. Millions of people pursuing their own ambitions and survival in a city that had been the center of global finance for centuries. Somewhere in those glass towers and ancient streets, the people responsible for her downfall were probably celebrating their successful elimination of a threat. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that a girl from the Kentucky mountains would collapse under the weight of their assault, would slink back to America defeated and discredited. They'd forgotten that survival in Appalachia required a kind of resilience that Wall Street's privileged class couldn't comprehend. Maddie opened her laptop and began making notes. Names, dates, patterns of behavior that her memory was already organizing into a coherent picture of betrayal. Tomorrow's meeting with Dmitry might provide the resources she needed to fight back. Sarah's technical skills could uncover the digital evidence of the conspiracy. But the strategy, the plan to turn her enemies' weapons against them, that would come from the same survival instincts that had carried her from poverty to power once before. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, was going to war. Dmitry Volkov's London headquarters occupied 3 floors of a gleaming Canary Wharf tower that commanded panoramic views of the Thames. As Maddie rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, she studied her reflection in the polished steel doors. The navy suit she'd packed for her original client meetings now felt like armor. Professional, understated, conveying competence without arrogance. The reception area spoke of understated power, Russian artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses, furniture that suggested comfort but demanded respect. Dmitry's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, led Maddie through Corridors lined with photographs documenting the rise of an energy empire from post-Soviet chaos to global influence. Dimitri's corner office was a study in controlled contradiction. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of London's financial district, but the desk was carved from a single piece of Siberian oak that spoke of older, deeper roots. The man himself rose from behind that desk, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. Ms. Crawford. His handshake was firm, calloused despite his obvious wealth. You look like hell. The blunt assessment might have offended her coming from anyone else, but Dimitri's directness felt refreshing after years of corporate doublespeak. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Volkov. I know my current situation makes me a liability. Sit. He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk, and stop talking like corporate robot. Yesterday you were Madison Crawford, architect of billion-dollar deals. Today you are Madison Crawford, victim of character assassination. Tomorrow you will be Madison Crawford, survivor. But only if you stop pretending this is normal business setback. His words cut through the professional facade she'd been maintaining since the phone call on the jet. The exhaustion of the last 36 hours, the betrayal, the systematic destruction of 18 months of work, it all crashed over her at once. For a moment, she felt dangerously close to tears. I don't understand why this happened, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The deal was solid. Every aspect was legitimate. I've never cut corners, never compromised my ethics. Of course you have not. Dimitri moved around the desk to take the chair beside her, his presence oddly comforting despite his intimidating reputation. That is precisely why they had to destroy you. He poured 2 glasses of tea from a samovar. That looked like a family heirloom, the ritual giving both of them a moment to collect their thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned experience. Let me tell you a story, Ms. Crawford. In 1995, I had small energy trading company in Moscow. Nothing fancy. We bought oil from producers, sold to refineries, made modest profit. But I had vision, and I had integrity. I honored contracts when market turned against me. I paid suppliers even when customers defaulted. Word spread that Dmitry Volkov could be trusted. He paused to sip his tea, his eyes focused on something far beyond the London skyline. Success made me enemies. Bigger companies saw young upstart, taking market share through old-fashioned honesty. They could not compete with my reputation, so they destroyed it instead. False accusations, forged documents, bribes to officials. Within 6 months, I lost everything. Company, reputation, even my house. Maddie felt a chill of recognition. The parallels to her own situation were too precise to be coincidental. But you rebuilt, she said. Volkov Energy is one of the largest independent oil companies in Europe. Yes, I rebuilt. But first I learned a hard lesson about power and fear. The people who destroyed me were not evil monsters. They were scared, mediocre men who saw my success as threat to their comfort. Your Marcus Chen? He is same type of man. The mention of Marcus's name sparked something angry in Maddie's chest. Marcus was my mentor. He helped me rise through the ranks, vouched for me with senior management, and took credit for your successes. Yes? Dimitri's smile was knowing but not unkind. Let me guess. Every major deal you closed somehow became example of his excellent leadership. Every client relationship you built became evidence of his strategic vision. The accuracy of his assessment was like a physical blow. Years of conversations crystallized in her memory, Marcus smoothly positioning himself as the architect of her achievements, while maintaining plausible deniability about taking credit. The subtle ways he'd redirected praise in his direction, the careful language that made her successes sound like implementations of his strategies. But why destroy me now? Why not just continue taking credit? Because this deal, Prometheus, was too big for him to claim as his own achievement. 5 companies across 3 continents, $1. $3 billion in value, international regulatory complexity that required your specific expertise. No one would believe he architected something this sophisticated. Dmitri stood and walked to the windows, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. More dangerous for him, this deal would have made you senior VP, maybe even managing director. Then you would be his equal, his rival. Scared, mediocre men cannot tolerate that possibility. The systematic nature of Marcus's betrayal was becoming clear with horrifying precision. This wasn't opportunistic sabotage, it was preemptive elimination of a threat to his position and ego. I received call this morning from Priya Sharma, Dmitri continued. Her company is in bad situation. Without Prometheus merger, she may not survive next quarter. 800 employees, most of them recent immigrants like her parents, will lose jobs. Your Marcus Chen has destroyed real people's lives to protect his vanity. The human cost of the conspiracy hit Maddie like a physical force. She'd been so focused on her own professional destruction that she hadn't fully processed what the deal's collapse meant for the thousands of employees whose companies had been counting on the merger. Priya's sustainable tech company, the Japanese manufacturing consortium, the smaller energy firms that were part of Dmitri's proposed expansion. All of them were now facing uncertainty because someone couldn't tolerate her success. We have to stop this, she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Not just for me, but for everyone who's going to be hurt by this sabotage. Dmitri turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled with genuine warmth. Now you sound like woman who can fight war instead of victim who accepts defeat. Good. Because this will be war, make no mistake. Your Marcus Chen has resources of entire investment bank, legal protection, institutional support. You have integrity and intelligence. But in short-term fight, that may not be enough. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting alliance. He returned to his desk and pulled out a file folder thick with documents. My resources, your expertise, shared goal of exposing truth. I have private jet, security team, investigators, who know how to find evidence that powerful men try to hide. You have intimate knowledge of this deal, relationships with clients. And, he paused, studying her with those cataloging eyes. You have hunger for justice that reminds me of myself at your age. The offer was more than Maddie had dared hope for, but experience had taught her to examine gifts carefully. What do you want in return? Prometheus deal completed as originally designed. My expansion plans depend on those partnerships, and I will not allow mediocre men to destroy good business because of their personal insecurities. Also, his smile turned slightly predatory. I want to watch Marcus Chen explain to Blackstone's board why he sabotaged billion-dollar merger to protect his ego. The partnership he was proposing would give her resources to fight back, but it would also mark her definitively as Dmitri's ally in what was sure to become a very public battle. There would be no going back to her old life at Blackstone, no possibility of quiet reconciliation. But as she thought about Priya Sharma's employees, about the careful architecture of the Prometheus deal that represented not just business success, but a model for ethical international finance, the choice became clear. I accept, she said, extending her hand. Dmitri's handshake was firm, sealing an alliance that would either restore her reputation or complete her destruction. Good. Now we plan offensive strategy. First stop, Dubai. Sheikh Al-Rashid has been receiving interesting communications from your former colleagues. I think you will want to hear what they have been telling him about you. The flight to Dubai aboard Dmitri's private jet felt surreal after the commercial aviation humiliation of her London arrival. The Gulfstream G650's cabin was appointed, with the understated luxury that serious money preferred: cream leather, polished wood, technology that whispered rather than shouted its sophistication. but Maddie barely noticed the comfort. Her attention was focused on the files spread across the conference table, intelligence that Dimitri's security team had gathered about the communications between Blackstone and her former clients. Sheikh al-Rashid received first contact from Marcus Chen 18 hours after your termination, Dimitri explained, his finger tracing a timeline his investigators had constructed. Phone call followed by email with confidential background information about your alleged compliance violations. Maddie studied the email intercept, her stomach tightening with each carefully crafted lie. The document portrayed her as reckless, possibly corrupt, someone whose ambitious nature had led her to cut corners and compromise the integrity of the deal. It was character assassination disguised as concerned disclosure. They're not just destroying my reputation, she realized. Aloud. They're poisoning my relationships with every client, making sure I can never rebuild these partnerships. Exactly. But Sheikh al-Rashid is not stupid man. He has been in international business for 40 years. He knows difference between legitimate concerns and corporate politics. The jet began its descent into Dubai as the sun painted the city's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. Through the oval windows, Maddie watched the architectural impossibilities of the emirate rise from the desert, gleaming towers that defied physics and economics alike, monuments to the audacity of human ambition. It reminded her of her own journey from the Kentucky mountains to the pinnacles of global finance. If a city could rise from sand dunes, perhaps a career could rise from deliberate destruction. Sheikh Khalid al-Rashid's offices occupied the top 3 floors of the Burj Khalifa's crown, a location that served as both practical workspace and psychological statement. As Maddie and Dimitri rode the high-speed elevator toward their appointment, she felt the familiar pre-negotiation tension that had once energized her. But this time, she wasn't selling a deal. She was fighting for her professional life. The Sheikh's reception area was a study in contemporary Arabian elegance, traditional patterns reinterpreted through modern materials and technology. The man himself rose from behind a desk that seemed to float above the city, his traditional robes contrasting with the cutting-edge technology that surrounded him. Ms. Crawford. His English carried the precision of Oxford education layered over accent that spoke of deeper roots. I must admit I was surprised to receive your request for this meeting. Your Excellency, I appreciate you taking the time to see me despite the circumstances. Maddie kept her voice steady, professional, but she could see in his eyes that Marcus's poison had already begun its work. Yes, the circumstances. The sheikh gestured for them to sit in chairs arranged around a low table where traditional coffee service waited. I received some very disturbing information about irregularities in the Prometheus documentation. Information? That suggests the deal may have been compromised from its inception. The careful phrasing told Maddie everything she needed to know about Marcus's strategy. He wasn't making direct accusations. That would be too risky, too easily disproven. Instead, he was seeding doubt, raising questions about her competence and integrity that would be impossible to definitively refute. Your Excellency, Dimitri, interjected smoothly. Before we discuss these alleged irregularities, perhaps Ms. Crawford could review the original documentation. As the deal's architect, she would be best positioned to address any specific concerns. The sheikh nodded and retrieved a file from his desk. As he handed it to Maddie, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. Clipped to the inside. Cover were pages she'd never seen before, addenda to the original partnership agreement that fundamentally altered the deal's structure. I'm sorry, she said carefully, but these supplemental documents weren't part of the original Prometheus framework. No? The sheikh's eyebrows rose. But they were included in the updated documentation I received from Blackstone yesterday. According to Mr. Chen, these represent corrections to errors in your initial drafts. Maddie's hands trembled slightly as she studied the fraudulent pages. The changes were subtle but devastating. Modification to profit-sharing arrangements that heavily favored the American partners, alterations to regulatory compliance language that would create legal vulnerabilities for the international participants. Someone had taken her carefully balanced agreement and turned it into exactly the kind of exploitative arrangement she'd spent her career trying to eliminate from international finance. Your Excellency, these documents are forgeries. Her voice carried the flat certainty of absolute conviction. I've never seen these pages before, and they contradict fundamental principles that guided every aspect of the Prometheus negotiations. The Sheikh's expression remained neutral, but she caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or recalculation. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Crawford. Are you suggesting that Blackstone and Associates would fabricate documentation? I'm suggesting that someone with access to the original files has altered them to discredit both me and the deal itself. Maddie leaned forward, her Appalachian directness cutting through diplomatic niceties. Your Excellency, you've known me for 8 months. Have I ever presented you with anything but transparent, ethical proposals? The silence stretched for long moments as the Sheikh studied her face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent evaluating human nature across cultural and linguistic barriers. No, Ms. Crawford, you have not. In fact, your approach has been refreshingly honest for an American investment banker. He paused, glancing at the fraudulent documents. But if these modifications are indeed falsifications, it raises disturbing questions about institutional integrity at Blackstone. It raises questions about individual integrity, Dmitri corrected quietly. This type of sophisticated forgery requires access to sealed documentation, knowledge of legal language, and willingness to commit fraud on international scale. Not many people at Blackstone have all three capabilities. The Sheikh nodded slowly, his business instincts clearly engaged. Mr. Volkov raises excellent point. Such an operation would require significant resources and coordination. He looked directly at Maddie. Who has this level of access to your work product? Senior management, the legal team, risk management. As she spoke the words, the scope of the conspiracy became clearer. But the sophisticated understanding of the deal's structure, the knowledge of which changes would be most damaging, that level of intimate familiarity is limited to a very small group. Including your former mentor, Marcus Chen, the Sheikh observed. Including Marcus, Maddie confirmed, the admission feeling like a physical wound. The Sheikh stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Dubai's impossible skyline. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from polite skepticism to something harder. Ms. Crawford, I have built my business relationships over 40 years by trusting my instincts about character. My instincts tell me you are victim of sophisticated betrayal, not perpetrator of fraud. He paused, his gaze steady on her face. But instincts are not sufficient for billion-dollar decisions. I need proof. What kind of proof? Maddie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Digital evidence of document tampering, communications showing coordination of this deception, financial trails showing who benefits from the deal's collapse. The Sheikh's smile was grim. The same evidence that would be required to prosecute this conspiracy in court. Dmitri leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Such evidence exists, but finding it will require resources and expertise that our enemies do not expect us to possess. What are you thinking? Maddie asked. I am thinking that Marcus Chen and his conspirators believe they have removed biggest threat to their plan, you. They will become careless, confident in their success. That carelessness will create opportunities. The Sheikh nodded approvingly. And I know someone who specializes in finding evidence that powerful men try to hide. Isabella Santos, Bloomberg financial reporter. Her investigation of the Meridian banking scandal last year resulted in 3 senior executives facing criminal charges. You want to involve the media? Maddie felt a chill of apprehension. Once journalists entered the picture, the battle would become irreversibly public. I want to involve someone whose reputation for integrity is beyond question and whose investigative resources exceed what we can marshal privately, the sheikh corrected. Ms. Santos has been asking questions about unusual trading patterns related to Prometheus. She may already be investigating this situation from another angle. As they discussed strategy, Maddie felt the familiar rush of complex planning that had always energized her. But this time, she wasn't architecting a merger. She was architecting a counterattack against forces that had underestimated her capacity for strategic thinking. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, was about to remind the global financial elite why survival skills learned in poverty were often more valuable than credentials earned in privilege. The Singapore skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Marina Bay Sands presidential suite as Maddie prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her professional life. James Wellington was somewhere in this vertical maze of luxury and commerce, and after 48 hours of digital cat and mouse, she'd finally cornered him into agreeing to a face-to-face meeting. Her hands were steady as she adjusted her jacket, the same navy suit that had served as armor through London and Dubai, now feeling like a second skin that conveyed competence and control. But underneath the professional facade, her heart hammered, with a complex mixture of anticipation, anger, and something she didn't want to examine too closely. James had been more than a colleague during their 3 years together at Blackstone. He'd been her intellectual equal, her sparring partner, the one person who understood the addictive rush of orchestrating complex international deals. He'd also been the man who'd shared her bed for 6 months before ambition and competition had driven them apart in a spectacular argument about ethics versus results. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now he was working for Morgan Hartley, Blackstone's primary rival, and every instinct she'd developed about corporate warfare suggested he was either complicit in her destruction or positioned to benefit from it. The suite's door opened without ceremony, and James Wellington walked in with the confident stride that had always characterized his approach to everything from boardroom negotiations to bedroom encounters. 5 years had added lines around his eyes and gray at his temples, but they'd also refined the sharp intelligence that had made him one of Wall Street's most effective dealmakers. Madison. His voice carried that familiar mixture of warmth and wariness that had defined their relationship. You look like hell, I know. Everyone keeps telling me. She gestured toward the sitting area where she'd arranged coffee service and a tablet displaying her evidence files. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Thank you for not having me kidnapped and dragged here, he replied with a slight smile. When Dmitry Volkov's security team suggests a meeting, the smart response is usually compliance. They settled into facing chairs with the careful distance of former lovers turned potential adversaries. James's eyes catalogued her appearance with the thoroughness she remembered, but his expression remained unreadable. So, he said, accepting the coffee she offered, I hear your career has taken an interesting turn. That's one way to describe systematic professional assassination. Maddie kept her voice level, but she was studying his micro-expressions for any sign of prior knowledge or complicity. The question is whether you're here as a friend or a competitor circling wounded prey. James's laugh was sharp, but not unkind. Direct as always. I've missed that about you, Madison. Most people in our business have forgotten how to ask uncomfortable questions. Then let me ask another one. Did you know about Marcus Chen's plans to destroy me? The question hung in the air between them like a blade. James set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his expression shifting from casual interest to something more focused and dangerous. What makes you think Marcus is responsible for your situation? Evidence. Communications. The fact that someone with intimate knowledge of my work has been systematically poisoning my client relationships while simultaneously altering deal. Documentation to make me look incompetent or corrupt. Maddie leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. James, They didn't just fire me. They orchestrated a comprehensive character assassination designed to ensure I could never rebuild my career. They? Marcus Chen, Bobby Castellano from Risk Management, possibly others. The level of coordination required suggests multiple participants with different areas of expertise. James was quiet for long moments, his gaze focused on something beyond the spectacular view of Singapore's harbor. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested internal struggle. Madison, there's something you need to know. Morgan Hartley has been tracking unusual trading patterns related to Prometheus for the past 3 weeks. Patterns that suggest someone with inside knowledge has been positioning for the deal's collapse. Her blood chilled. What kind of trading patterns? Short positions against all 5 participating companies, timed perfectly to coincide with your termination announcement. Currency hedges that only make sense if someone knew the merger would fail. Option strategies that would generate massive profits from the exact type of market disruption that occurred when Prometheus collapsed. The implications hit her like physical blows. This wasn't just professional sabotage, it was financial fraud on an international scale. Someone hadn't just destroyed her career, they'd profited from the destruction of her deal. How much money are we talking about? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Conservative estimate? 50 to 70 million in profits across multiple instruments and currencies. Enough to justify significant upfront investment in orchestrating the collapse. Maddie felt sick. The scale of the conspiracy was beyond anything she'd imagined. This wasn't Marcus protecting his ego. This was a coordinated financial crime that used her destruction as cover for massive illegal profits. Why didn't Morgan Hartley report this to the authorities? James's smile was grim. Because we couldn't prove the connection between the trading patterns and the deal's collapse. Until your termination, it looked like sophisticated but legal speculation. Now it looks like inside trading based on advanced knowledge of sabotage. Maddie's mind raced through the implications. James, if this is accurate, we're not just talking about corporate politics. We're talking about securities fraud, market manipulation, conspiracy charges that could destroy entire careers. Which is why I agreed to this meeting. James pulled out his own tablet and opened a file thick with financial data. Morgan Hartley's investigation found evidence of coordination between the trading activities and communications from Blackstone. But we need someone with intimate knowledge of the Prometheus structure to connect the dots definitively. You need me to help you build a case against my former employer. The irony wasn't lost on her. James's firm stood to benefit significantly from Blackstone's legal troubles. I need you to help build a case against criminals who happen to work for your former employer, he corrected. Madison, I know we have complicated history, but I also know your integrity. Whatever these people did to you, they did it for money, not principle. As they spread the financial data across the coffee table, Maddie felt the familiar rush of complex analysis that had always been her greatest strength. But this time, instead of structuring a merger, she was deconstructing a crime. The pattern emerged with crystalline clarity as they cross-referenced trading timelines with her meeting schedules, correlated currency movements with client communications, mapped the geography of financial positions against the international scope of the Prometheus deal. My God, she whispered, looking up from a particularly damning set of options contracts. They've been planning this for months. Some of these positions were established before I even finalized the preliminary agreements. Which means they had to know the deal's structure in advance, James observed. They needed someone with access to your confidential planning documents. Marcus. The name felt like poison in her mouth. He's been positioning himself as my mentor and advocate while simultaneously feeding information to whoever orchestrated this trading scheme. James nodded grimly. The question now is whether we can prove it in a way that would satisfy prosecutors and regulators in 4 different countries. We can prove it, Maddie said with growing confidence. but we'll need help from someone with the resources to investigate international financial crime and the credibility to ensure the evidence is taken seriously. Isabella Santos, James suggested. Bloomberg's financial crime specialist. She's been asking questions about Prometheus already. Dimitri mentioned her, said she'd been investigating unusual trading patterns. Then we're all converging on the same target from different directions. James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The question is whether we're willing to work together despite our institutional loyalties and personal history. Maddie looked at him across the coffee table littered with evidence of betrayal and fraud, remembering the man who'd once shared her ambitions and her bed, who'd challenged her thinking and supported her dreams before competition had poisoned their relationship. James, 5 years ago we let professional rivalry destroy something that might have been important. Are we mature enough now to put justice ahead of personal complications? His smile was small but genuine. Madison Crawford, are you proposing an alliance? I'm proposing we finish what we started 5 years ago, finding out whether integrity can survive in a business built on ambition and greed. The handshake they shared sealed more than a partnership in pursuit of justice. It marked the beginning of a reckoning that would either restore their reputations or complete their destruction. The war room James had arranged in his Singapore hotel suite looked like a financial crime investigator's fever dream. 3 laptops, 2 tablets, printed documents covering every surface, and a secure video connection to Sarah Kim's encrypted workspace in New York. Coffee cups and takeout containers marked the passage of 18 hours spent building an airtight case against the people who'd destroyed Maddie's career for profit. Sarah, can you trace the origin of the altered Prometheus documents? Maddie asked, studying her former assistant's face on the laptop screen. Despite the early morning hour in New York, Sarah looked energized by the complexity of the digital investigation. Already on it. The metadata shows multiple revision layers, but whoever did this was sophisticated about covering their tracks. Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. However, they couldn't completely eliminate the digital fingerprints. The alterations were made using Bobby Castellanos' risk management access codes. James looked up from his analysis of the trading patterns. That's the smoking gun. Risk management access would be required to modify sealed deal documentation, and it would provide the institutional credibility needed to distribute fraudulent versions to clients. But Bobby's not smart enough to orchestrate something this complex, Maddie observed. He's detail-oriented and paranoid, but he doesn't have the strategic vision to plan months ahead. Someone else is directing his actions. The secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from Dimitri. Maddie answered on speaker, his voice filling the room with characteristic directness. I have interesting development. My London investigators intercepted communication between Marcus Chen and offshore investment fund based in Cayman Islands. Fund manager is Felix Morrison. Does this name mean anything to you? Maddie's blood chilled. Felix was a senior partner at Blackstone until 3 years ago. He left under circumstances that were never fully explained, but there were rumors about regulatory concerns. What kind of regulatory concerns? James asked, though his expression suggested he suspected the answer. The kind that make people relocate to jurisdictions with banking secrecy laws and limited extradition treaties, Maddie replied grimly. If Felix is involved, this conspiracy has access to international money laundering infrastructure. Sarah's voice cut through their conversation with urgent intensity. Guys, you need to see this. I've been analyzing the trading patterns James provided, and I found something that changes everything. She shared her screen, displaying a complex network diagram that mapped financial flows across multiple jurisdictions and instruments. The visualization looked like a spider web of international crime, with threads connecting Cayman Islands funds to Swiss accounts to Singapore trading platforms. The profits from the Prometheus sabotage weren't just going to a few individuals, Sarah explained. They were being channeled through a sophisticated money laundering operation that's been active for at least 2 years. This isn't Marcus protecting his ego. This is an organized criminal enterprise using Blackstone as a front for market manipulation. The scope of what they'd uncovered was staggering. What had begun as investigation into professional sabotage had revealed an international conspiracy that turned one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms into a vehicle for financial crime. "How many deals has this affected?" Maddie asked, though she dreaded the answer. Based on the pattern analysis, at least 12 major transactions over the past 18 months. Combined value of deals that were sabotaged or manipulated, approximately $8 billion. Sarah's voice carried the weight of devastating revelation. "Maddie, you weren't their first victim. You were just the biggest." James ran his hands through his hair, the magnitude of the conspiracy clearly overwhelming. "This is beyond securities fraud. We're looking at racketeering, money laundering, international conspiracy charges that could bring down entire institutions. Which is exactly why we need to be very careful about how we proceed," Dimitri's voice warned through the speaker. "People who orchestrate crimes on this scale have resources to eliminate threats. We are no longer dealing with ambitious bankers. We are dealing with criminals who have billions of reasons to silence us." The sobering reality of their situation settled over the room like a cold fog. They'd uncovered evidence of massive financial crimes, but they'd also painted targets on their backs for people with the means and motivation to make problems disappear permanently. "We need Isabella Santos," Maddie decided. "We need someone with the credibility and resources to ensure this evidence reaches prosecutors before our enemies realize how much we know." "Already arranged," Dimitri replied. "She arrives in Singapore tomorrow morning. But there is complication. Marcus Chen is also traveling to Asia. My sources suggest he plans to meet with remaining Prometheus clients to finalize alternative arrangements. That would complete the deal under his control. He's trying to steal the merger outright," James realized. "Not just destroy Maddie's career, but claim credit for salvaging her work." "More than that," Maddie said, her strategic mind processing the implications. "If he can present himself as the hero who rescued the deal from my alleged incompetence, he'll have the credibility to orchestrate future manipulations without suspicion." Sarah's face on the screen showed the strain of 18 hours spent uncovering criminal conspiracies. "There's something else. I've been monitoring internal Blackstone communications, and there's chatter about a board meeting scheduled for Friday. Emergency session to address compliance concerns and leadership transitions. They're moving to consolidate control," Maddie realized. Marcus must feel confident enough in his position to make his play for senior partnership. "Then we have less than 72 hours to expose this conspiracy before it becomes institutionalized," James observed. "Once Marcus gains formal control, he'll have the authority to bury evidence and eliminate witnesses." The ticking clock added urgency to their already dangerous situation. They were racing not just to clear Maddie's name, but to prevent an international criminal organization from gaining complete control of one of the world's most influential investment banks. "Dimitri, where is Marcus planning to meet with the clients?" Maddie asked. "Tokyo, Yamamoto Industries headquarters. He has convinced them that emergency restructuring is necessary to salvage the deal." "Perfect." Maddie's smile was cold and calculating. "James, how would you like to attend that meeting as an interested observer from Morgan Hartley? And you?" "I'll be there as the architect of the original deal, with evidence that proves Marcus has been defrauding everyone involved." She looked at the array of evidence spread across the hotel room. Financial records, communication intercepts, trading analysis that painted a clear picture of international conspiracy. It's time for a reckoning. The next 18 hours would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, whether integrity could survive in a world where billion-dollar deals were made and broken by whispered conversations in private jets. But for the first time since receiving that devastating phone call over the Atlantic, Maddie Crawford felt like she was fighting from a position of strength rather than desperation. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, was about to remind the global financial elite that survival skills learned in poverty were often more valuable than credentials earned in privilege. The 47th floor of Yamamoto Industries' Tokyo headquarters commanded a spectacular view of the city's morning rush, millions of people pursuing their ambitions beneath a sky painted in shades of pearl and gold. Maddie stood at the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the controlled chaos below while mentally rehearsing the presentation that would either vindicate her reputation or complete her destruction. Behind her, the conference table gleamed with the understated elegance that characterized Japanese business culture: polished wood, precise arrangements, technology that whispered rather than shouted its sophistication. In 30 minutes, the most important meeting of her career would begin in this room, with stakes that extended far beyond her personal vindication. "The security sweep is complete." Dimitri's voice carried quiet authority as he entered the conference room with his usual direct bearing. "Isabella Santos and her technical team have confirmed the recording equipment is functioning. Whatever happens in this room will be documented with courtroom-quality evidence." James looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing the final elements of their presentation. "Marcus's flight landed 2 hours ago. According to our sources, he spent the morning meeting privately with Yamamoto's senior executives, no doubt poisoning the well with more lies about Maddie's alleged incompetence." "Let him dig his grave deeper," Maddie replied, her voice carrying a calm that surprised even her. "Every lie he tells will be contradicted by evidence. Every accusation he makes will boomerang back to expose his own crimes." The irony wasn't lost on her that this confrontation was taking place in Tokyo, where 18 months ago she'd first conceived the Prometheus deal during a late-night strategy session in this very building. She'd been younger then, more naive, about the capacity for betrayal that lurked beneath the surface of professional relationships. But she'd also been just as determined, just as capable of strategic thinking under pressure. "Ms. Crawford?" Kenji Yamamoto entered the conference room with the quiet dignity that had made his family's manufacturing empire a pillar of Japanese industry for 3 generations. His English carried the precision of international education, but his bearing spoke of deeper cultural roots. "I must admit, I was surprised to receive your request for this meeting. Mr. Yamamoto, I appreciate your willingness to hear my perspective before finalizing any alternative arrangements." Maddie bowed slightly, acknowledging both his courtesy and the gravity of the situation. "I believe you'll find the information we've uncovered both shocking and relevant to your company's interests." The conference room began filling with the key participants who would determine the Prometheus deal's fate. Marcus Chen arrived with Bobby Castellano in tow, both men projecting the confident authority of winners who'd successfully eliminated their primary obstacle. Marcus's smile was warm and political as he greeted the Japanese executives, but Maddie caught the flicker of surprise and concern when he noticed her presence. "Madison?" His voice carried just the right mixture of professional courtesy and personal regret. "I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you'd return to New York to address your legal situation." "My legal situation is quite clear, Marcus. The question is whether yours will be equally transparent after today's presentation." She kept her voice level, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. Isabella Santos entered with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to asking uncomfortable questions in powerful rooms. The Bloomberg journalist's reputation for integrity and thoroughness had made her both respected and feared in international financial circles. Her presence transformed the meeting from corporate negotiation into something more consequential. "Before we begin," Marcus said, his political instincts clearly sensing danger, "I should note that Ms. Crawford is no longer affiliated with Blackstone and Associates. Her presence here may create legal complications for all parties involved." "On the contrary," Isabella interjected smoothly, "Ms. Crawford's presence is essential for understanding the full scope of the irregularities that have emerged around the Prometheus transaction. irregularities that extend far beyond questions of professional competence. The word irregularities hung in the air like a blade. Marcus's expression remained composed, but Maddie caught the micro-expressions of concern that her childhood had taught her to read. The slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that suggested a man preparing for attack. "Ms. Santos," Mr. Yamamoto said carefully, "what kind of irregularities are you referring to?" "The kind that involve securities fraud, market manipulation, and international money laundering," Isabella replied with the matter-of-fact tone that had characterized her award-winning investigations. "The kind that have generated approximately $70 million in illegal profits while destroying legitimate business relationships." The conference room fell silent, except for the whisper of climate control and the distant hum of Tokyo. Traffic. Marcus's facade of professional confidence began showing hairline cracks. "That's a serious accusation," Bobby Castellano interjected, his risk management instincts engaging. "I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims." "We have overwhelming evidence," Maddie replied, activating the room's presentation system. "Evidence that proves the Prometheus deal was sabotaged not by incompetence, but by a criminal conspiracy designed to generate profits from market manipulation." The first slide appeared on the conference room's wall-mounted displays, a timeline showing the correlation between confidential deal milestones and offshore trading activities. The pattern was damning in its precision. Every significant development in the Prometheus negotiations had been preceded by trading positions that would profit from specific outcomes. "This analysis shows trading patterns that could only be based on inside knowledge of confidential negotiations," James explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years analyzing market behavior. "The timing and sophistication suggest coordination between individuals with access to sealed documentation and offshore investment funds." Marcus leaned forward, his expression shifting from confidence to calculation. "Perhaps," Maddie agreed, "but not when they're coordinated with systematic alteration of deal documentation designed to sabotage client relationships." The next series of slides documented the fraudulent changes made to the Prometheus agreements, alterations, that had turned her carefully balanced international partnership into an exploitative arrangement that favored American interests. The metadata analysis Sarah had provided showed the digital fingerprints that traced the changes to Bobby Castellano's access codes. The individuals responsible for these alterations had to possess 3 specific capabilities, Maddie continued, her presentation building toward inevitable conclusion. Access to sealed documentation, sophisticated understanding of international financial law, and knowledge of which modifications would be most damaging to client relationships. Mr. Yamamoto studied the evidence with the careful attention of someone who'd built his reputation on thorough analysis. "Ms. Crawford, are you suggesting that these alterations were made deliberately to sabotage the transaction?" "I'm proving." The final slide appeared, a network diagram showing the flow of profits from the Prometheus sabotage through offshore accounts controlled by Felix Morrison's Cayman Islands Fund. The same individuals who altered the documentation profited directly from the deal's collapse. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating. Marcus Chen's carefully constructed facade crumbled as the scope of his conspiracy became clear to everyone in the room. But instead of confession or collapse, something darker emerged in his expression. "This is an interesting conspiracy theory," he said, his voice gaining a dangerous edge. "But it's based on circumstantial evidence and correlation analysis that wouldn't survive serious legal scrutiny." "Then you won't mind cooperating with the international investigation that begins tomorrow morning," Isabella replied calmly. "Investigators from the SEC, the FSA, the MS, and the FSB will be conducting coordinated raids on all relevant institutions and offshore accounts." The mention of multiple regulatory agencies conducting simultaneous raids across 4 countries hit Marcus like a physical blow. The realization that his criminal enterprise was about to be dismantled by international law enforcement drained the color from his face. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The people behind this operation have resources you can't imagine. They won't allow their investment to be destroyed by naive idealists. The only thing being destroyed here is a criminal conspiracy," Dmitri stated with quiet finality. "And the only people who will face consequences are those who chose profit over integrity." As the meeting concluded with Mr. Yamamoto's commitment to cooperate fully with the investigation, Maddie felt a complex mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The conspiracy that had destroyed her career was finally exposed, but the battle for justice was just beginning. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, had faced down an international criminal organization and won. But the cost of victory remained to be calculated. The Blackstone and Associates boardroom on the 42nd floor of their Manhattan headquarters had been the site of decisions affecting trillions of dollars over the decades. Original Rothko paintings hung on walls lined with first-edition financial texts, and the conference table was carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood that had cost more than most people's houses. But on this gray November morning, the room felt more like a courtroom than a corporate sanctuary. Maddie sat at one end of the imposing table, flanked by her attorney and Isabella Santos, facing the 7-member board of directors who would determine Blackstone's response to the criminal conspiracy that had metastasized within their institution. The evidence spread before them told a story of betrayal that extended far beyond her individual case. 18 months of systematic fraud that had compromised the integrity of one of Wall Street's most prestigious firms. Board Chairman Harrison Blackwell, grandson of the firm's founder, studied the financial analysis with the grim expression of someone watching a family legacy crumble. At 73, he'd survived market crashes, regulatory upheavals, and competitive challenges that had destroyed lesser institutions. But the scope of criminal activity documented in Isabella's investigation represented an existential threat to everything his family had built. "Ms. Crawford," his voice carried the weight of generations spent in positions of power, "I want to personally apologize for the institutional failures that enabled this conspiracy. The evidence you've presented suggests a level of corruption that contradicts everything Blackstone has stood for over the past century. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell, but apologies, while appreciated, won't restore the careers that were destroyed, or the deals that were sabotaged for criminal profit." Maddie's voice remained steady, but underneath lay the steel forged in Kentucky mountains and tempered by months of betrayal. The boardroom doors opened to admit Bobby Castellano, flanked by FBI agents and federal prosecutors. The former head of risk management looked like he'd aged a decade in the week since the international raids had dismantled the offshore money laundering network. His cooperation with law enforcement had been swift and comprehensive once faced with the alternative of decades in federal prison. Mr. Castellano, U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen addressed him with professional formality. "Please tell the board about your role in the conspiracy to defraud Blackstone's clients and manipulate international markets." Bobby's voice was barely above a whisper as he detailed 18 months of criminal activity that had turned risk management into a vehicle for fraud. Document alteration, insider trading coordination, money laundering through offshore accounts. Each revelation struck the board members like physical blows. "How many deals were affected?" Board member Margaret Foster asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. 12 major transactions over 18 months, combined value of approximately $8 billion in manipulated or sabotaged mergers and acquisitions. Bobby's confession continued with devastating precision. "The Prometheus deal was intended to be our biggest score, but also our last. Felix Morrison was planning to relocate the entire operation to Southeast Asia." "And Marcus Chen's role?" Chairman Blackwell's question carried the inevitability of a death sentence. Marcus identified targets, provided inside information, and coordinated the timing of sabotage activities. But he wasn't the architect of the conspiracy. That was Felix Morrison. Marcus was more like a highly paid asset who provided institutional access. The characterization of her former mentor as a criminal asset rather than a mastermind was almost more devastating than learning about his betrayal. Marcus had destroyed her career not for grand ambitions or ideological convictions, but for money. He'd sold out everything she'd believed about their professional relationship for a percentage of criminal profits. "Where is Marcus now?" Isabella asked, though her investigative work had already provided part of the answer. "In custody in Singapore," U.S. Attorney Chen replied. "Extradition proceedings are underway, but given the international scope of the conspiracy, he's facing charges in multiple jurisdictions. Conservative estimate, 40 to 60 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts." The board absorbed this information with the shell-shocked expression of people watching their institution's reputation disintegrate in real time. But it was Priya Sharma's testimony that transformed abstract financial crimes into human consequences. 837 employees. Priya's voice carried the weight of personal responsibility that defined ethical leadership. "That's how many people work for my company. How many families depend on the wages we provide." When the Prometheus deal collapsed, I had to choose between massive layoffs or bankruptcy. I chose layoffs, but the human cost has been devastating. Her words hung in the boardroom's rarefied air like an indictment of the entire system that allowed financial crimes to destroy real people's lives. The conspiracy hadn't just stolen money, it had shattered communities, destroyed careers, eliminated opportunities for thousands of workers who'd never heard of offshore trading or document manipulation. "Ms. Sharma," Chairman Blackwell said, "carefully, what would it take to restore your faith in this institution?" "Accountability," she replied without hesitation. "Not just for the criminals who orchestrated this conspiracy, but for the institutional failures that enabled it. Structural changes that ensure this kind of betrayal can never happen again." Board member David Kim leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Crawford, you've experienced this conspiracy's impact more directly than anyone else. What reforms would you recommend?" Maddie had been preparing for this question since the moment she'd learned about the scope of the criminal enterprise. Her recommendations reflected not just technical expertise, but the moral clarity that had guided her through months of professional destruction. Complete separation of deal architecture from risk management functions, independent oversight of all document modifications, real-time monitoring of trading activities by senior staff members, and most importantly, a cultural shift that prioritizes institutional integrity over individual profit maximization. "Those are substantial changes," Board Member Foster observed. "They would require significant investment. My investigation found evidence that similar criminal conspiracies are active at 3 other major investment banks. The entire industry is facing a credibility crisis that could trigger regulatory intervention unprecedented since the 1930s. The threat of regulatory intervention focused the board's attention with laser intensity. Federal oversight of investment banking operations would be far more expensive and restrictive than voluntary reforms implemented proactively. "Mr. Blackwell," Maddie said, sensing the moment for her final argument. "Blackstone can either lead the industry's reform movement or become another casualty of systemic corruption. The choice will define your family's legacy for generations." The chairman's expression revealed the internal struggle between institutional pride and pragmatic necessity. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone making decisions that would reshape an entire industry. "Ms. Crawford, would you be willing to lead Blackstone's institutional reform initiative? Your experience with this conspiracy, combined with your reputation for integrity, makes you uniquely qualified to guide our transformation." The offer was unexpected, overwhelming, and fraught with complications. Returning to Blackstone would mean working within the institution that had betrayed her, rebuilding trust with colleagues who'd believed the lies about her competence and character. But it would also mean the opportunity to create systemic change that could prevent future conspiracies, to transform her personal vindication into industry-wide reform. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had first carried her from Kentucky mountains to Wall Street pinnacles. "But I have conditions." The negotiation that followed established the framework for the most comprehensive reform of investment banking practices in decades. As the meeting concluded, Maddie felt the complex satisfaction of survival transformed into opportunity for systemic change. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, hadn't just cleared her name, she'd positioned herself to reshape an entire industry. The flight to Kentucky felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying Maddie further from the glass towers and international conspiracies that had dominated her life for the past months. As the private jet Dimitri had insisted she use descended through autumn clouds toward the small regional airport outside Hazard, she watched familiar mountains emerge from the mist like ancient guardians welcoming her home. 3 weeks had passed since the Blackstone board meeting that had restored her reputation and positioned her to lead industry reform. 3 weeks of congressional testimony, regulatory briefings, and media interviews that had transformed her, from victim to symbol of integrity triumphing over corruption. But success felt hollow without the perspective that only her grandmother could provide. The drive from the airport to her childhood home took her through hollows where poverty still carved deep lines in the landscape, past trailer parks and shuttered coal mines that reminded her of how far she'd traveled and how much she'd risked in pursuing her Wall Street ambitions. The contrast between this world and the one she'd inhabited for the past decade was stark enough to induce vertigo. Her grandmother's trailer sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through hills painted in October's gold and crimson. The aluminum siding had faded since Maddie's last visit, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of decades. But the small garden still bloomed with late-season flowers that spoke of persistent hope. Eleanor Crawford emerged from the trailer with the same steady bearing that had carried her through 78 years of Appalachian life. Her silver hair was pulled back in the practical bun Maddie remembered from childhood, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had guided her granddaughter through the complex navigation of poverty, education, and ambition. "Well," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the dry humor that had always characterized their relationship, "I suppose you've had yourself quite an adventure up there in the big city." The understatement was so characteristically Kentucky that Maddie found herself laughing for the first time in months, real laughter that came from somewhere deeper than professional satisfaction or strategic victory. "That's one way to describe an international criminal conspiracy, Grandma. Come inside, baby girl. Coffee's on, and I expect you've got some stories that need telling." The trailer's interior was exactly as Maddie remembered, small but scrupulously clean, decorated with photographs documenting generations of Crawford family history. The kitchen table where she'd done homework throughout high school was now covered with newspaper clippings about her testimony before Congress, articles that described her as the whistleblower who exposed Wall Street corruption. "I've been reading about your troubles," Eleanor said, pouring coffee into the same chipped mugs they'd shared during Maddie's childhood. "Sounds like that mentor of yours turned out to be a snake in a suit." "Marcus wasn't just a snake, Grandma. He was part of something bigger, something that destroyed people's lives for profit." Maddie accepted the coffee gratefully, the familiar ritual grounding her in memories of simpler times. "Honey, I've lived long enough to know that evil rarely announces itself with horns and pitchforks. Most of the time, it wears a nice smile and talks about practical necessities." Eleanor settled into the chair across from her, studying Maddie's face with the penetrating attention that had always made lying impossible. "Question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" It was the question Maddie had been avoiding for weeks, buried under the demands of congressional testimony and reform planning. The Blackstone board had offered her unprecedented authority to reshape industry practices, but accepting their offer meant remaining in a world where corruption lurked beneath every professional relationship. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to take the Blackstone position and try to change things from the inside. But another part wonders if the whole system is too corrupt to reform, if I'm just setting myself up for more betrayal." Eleanor sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to the window that offered a view of the mountains that had sheltered generations of their family. "Your daddy used to talk about the mines the same way," she said quietly. "Always debating whether to fight for better conditions or just give up and find different work. In the end, the choice got made for him when that tunnel collapsed." The reference to her parents' death in the mining accident that had orphaned her was unexpected, painful, but also illuminating. Her father had died fighting for workplace safety in an industry that prioritized profits over human lives. The parallel to her own situation was uncomfortable, but undeniable. "You think I should stay and fight? I think you should do what feels right in your heart, not what feels safe or profitable or politically smart." Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze Maddie's hand. "You've already proven you can survive betrayal and come back stronger. The question now is whether you're going to use that strength for yourself or for people who can't fight their own battles." The wisdom in those words settled into Maddie's chest like a warm weight. Her grandmother was right. This wasn't about career advancement or personal vindication anymore. It was about whether she would use her position to protect others from the kind of systematic exploitation she'd experienced. "There's something else," Maddie said, pulling out her phone to show Eleanor a photograph from the previous week's meeting with Priya Sharma. "I've been offered a different kind of opportunity." The image showed Priya's sustainable technology facility, where 800 employees had been restored to full employment thanks to emergency financing Maddie had helped arrange. It represented a different model of business, one that prioritized social responsibility alongside profitability. "Priya wants me to help her build an alternative to traditional investment banking, ethical financing for companies that prioritize environmental sustainability and worker welfare over maximum profit extraction." Eleanor studied the photograph with the careful attention she'd always given to important decisions. "Sounds like the kind of work that might actually matter." "It would mean walking away from Wall Street entirely, giving up the prestige and compensation that I've spent my career building toward." "Baby girl, you've already lost everything once and built it back better. You think prestige and money are going to protect you from the next Marcus Chen who comes along?" The question crystallized something that had been troubling Maddie since her vindication. Success within the existing system would always be vulnerable to the kind of systematic corruption she'd uncovered. Real security lay not in climbing higher within a compromised institution, but in building something better. "I think I know what I want to do," she said, feeling a certainty that had been absent for months. "Good. Now let's talk about that boy from Singapore who's been calling here every day asking about you." Maddie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "James has been calling you? Seems like a nice young man. Polite, respectful, asked permission before. He started courting my granddaughter long distance." Eleanor's smile was knowing and slightly mischievous. "Question is, whether you're ready to trust someone again after what you've been through." The question of trust was more complex than romantic consideration. Her relationship with James was, she would build something new, something that honored the integrity her grandmother had instilled in her while addressing the systemic problems she'd uncovered, and she would do it with people who shared her commitment to ethics over expedience. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky was ready to go home, not to the mountains, but to the values that had always guided her through the most treacherous terrain. 6 months later, Madison Crawford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new office in Manhattan's financial district, watching the controlled chaos of morning rush hour 30 floors below. The space was smaller than her old Blackstone, suite furnished with reclaimed wood and sustainable materials that reflected the values of Crawford Sharma ethical finance. But the view of New York Harbor reminded her daily that some ambitions were worth pursuing regardless of traditional measures of success. "The Morrison Holdings documents just arrived," Sarah Kim announced from the doorway, her arms full of files that represented their newest challenge. "Priya's analysis confirms what we suspected. They're laundering money through sustainable energy investments while actually funding coal mining operations in Southeast Asia." Maddie turned from the window with the focused attention that had always characterized her approach to complex problems. The irony that Felix Morrison, Marcus Chen's partner in the Prometheus conspiracy, was still operating criminal enterprises from federal prison wasn't lost on her. But it provided their firm with exactly the kind of case that justified their unconventional approach to investment banking. "Set up a secure conference room," she instructed. "I want James and Dimitri on video link, and see if Isabella can join us remotely. If we're going to expose Morrison's prison-based money laundering operation, we'll need coordination across multiple jurisdictions." The past 6 months had transformed Maddie's understanding of what success could look like. Crawford Sharma Ethical Finance specialized in transactions that traditional investment banks avoided. Deals where profitability was balanced against social responsibility, where due diligence included evaluating environmental impact and worker welfare alongside financial projections. Their client list read like a directory of companies trying to build a better model of capitalism. Renewable energy cooperatives, fair trade manufacturing operations, technology firms committed to digital equity. The work was complex, often frustrating, and significantly less lucrative than traditional Wall Street deal-making. It was also the most professionally satisfying experience of Maddie's career. "Madison?" James Wellington's voice carried across the office as he emerged from the conference room where he'd been reviewing contracts for their latest solar energy financing deal. "The Japanese consortium wants to expand the partnership to include wind farms in Scotland. Are you interested in structuring an international renewable energy platform?" The question represented exactly the kind of opportunity that had drawn James away from Morgan Hartley's traditional practices to join their experimental firm. His reputation for sophisticated financial structuring, combined with his growing commitment to ethical investing, made him an invaluable partner in both professional and personal contexts. "Absolutely," Maddie replied, feeling the familiar rush of complex planning that had always energized her. "But let's make sure the Scottish operations include local workforce development and community ownership components. I don't want to recreate colonial extraction models with sustainable technology." Their relationship had evolved slowly over the months since the Tokyo confrontation, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than the competitive dynamics that had defined their earlier involvement. Trust, Maddie had learned, was something that had to be constructed deliberately, conversation by conversation, decision by decision. The office door opened to admit Priya Sharma, carrying coffee and the morning's financial publications that tracked their industry's gradual acknowledgement that ethical investing might represent more than a niche market for idealistic clients. Dimitri's investment in the renewable platform exceeded projections by 30%, she announced, settling into one of the conference room chairs with the satisfaction of someone watching carefully planned strategies succeed. "His London office wants to discuss expanding our partnership to include energy infrastructure throughout Eastern Europe." Dmitry Volkov's evolution from unlikely ally to foundational investor had been one of the most gratifying aspects of their firm's development. His commitment to their ethical framework went beyond financial return to encompass a vision of business practices that honored integrity above profit maximization. "That's excellent news," Maddie said, reviewing the investment summary Priya provided. "But I want to make sure we maintain our due diligence standards even as we scale up operations. The moment we compromise our principles for growth, we become just another investment bank with better marketing." The commitment to maintaining ethical standards while building a sustainable business model was the daily challenge that defined their work. Traditional investment banking offered clear metrics for success: profit margins, deal volume, market share. Ethical finance required balancing those considerations against impacts that were harder to quantify, but ultimately more important. Speaking of maintaining standards, Sarah interjected from her workstation, Isabella Santos wants to interview you about the Morrison Holdings investigation. Apparently, federal prosecutors are considering additional charges based on the evidence we've uncovered. The ongoing pursuit of justice for the Prometheus conspiracy had become a secondary focus of Maddie's work, a reminder that accountability required persistent effort long after initial victories. Marcus Chen was serving his federal sentence. Bobby Castellano had become a government witness in exchange for reduced charges, and Felix Morrison faced additional prosecution for continuing criminal activities from prison. Schedule the interview for this afternoon, Maddie decided, but make sure she understands that our focus is on building better systems, not just punishing bad actors. As the morning progressed through client calls, strategic planning sessions, and contract reviews, Maddie felt the deep satisfaction that came from work aligned with personal values. The financial rewards were modest compared to traditional Wall Street compensation, but the sense of purpose was immeasurable. The secure phone buzzed with an encrypted call from Dimitri's London office. His familiar voice filled the conference room with characteristic directness. Madison, I have interesting proposal. Russian government has approached me about structuring ethical financing for Siberian wind energy development. They want partner who can navigate international regulatory requirements while maintaining transparency standards that satisfy European Union oversight. The complexity of the proposed transaction was staggering. Renewable energy development in a politically sensitive region, requiring coordination between Russian developers, European regulators, and international investors. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had always excited Maddie's strategic thinking. Dimitri, that's a fascinating opportunity, but the geopolitical implications would require extensive due diligence and probably United Nations involvement to ensure legitimacy. Precisely why they need Crawford Sharma ethical finance, he replied, with evident satisfaction. Traditional investment banks cannot provide credibility required for this type of international cooperation. But firm with your reputation for integrity could bridge political divisions through focus. Precisely why they need Crawford Sharma ethical finance, he replied with evident satisfaction. Traditional investment banks cannot provide credibility required for this type of international cooperation. But firm with your reputation for integrity could bridge political divisions through focus on environmental benefits that transcend national boundaries. The proposal represented everything Maddie had hoped their firm could accomplish, using ethical finance as a tool for addressing global challenges that traditional institutions were too compromised or risk-averse to tackle. But it also illustrated the delicate balance between ambition and principle that defined their daily operations. Send us the preliminary documentation, she decided. We'll conduct a full ethical impact assessment before making any commitments. If we can structure legitimate environmental benefits while maintaining transparency standards, it might be worth pursuing. After ending the call, Maddie found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. 18 months ago, she'd been a traditional investment banker whose primary concerns were deal volume and profit margins. The betrayal that had destroyed her Blackstone career had also liberated her from a system that prioritized financial engineering over real-world impact. Maddie? James appeared in her office doorway, his expression carrying the mix of professional focus and personal concern that had become familiar over their months of partnership. Do you have a few minutes? I wanted to discuss something that's not strictly business. The careful phrasing suggested personal rather than professional conversation, which still felt slightly awkward despite their growing relationship. Learning. To trust someone romantically after experiencing systematic professional betrayal required conscious effort to separate past trauma from present reality. Of course, the logic was sound, but emotion didn't always follow rational analysis. Maddie had spent months rebuilding her professional confidence. Rebuilding her capacity for personal trust felt like an equally daunting challenge. "I need time," she said finally. "Not because I don't care about you, but because I need to be sure my feelings are based on who you actually are, not on gratitude for your support during the crisis." James nodded with the understanding that had characterized his approach to their relationship from the beginning. "Take all the time you need. What we've built professionally is valuable, regardless of whether it develops into something more personal. I'd rather have you as a trusted partner than risk losing that by pushing for something you're not ready for." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's voice over the intercom, announcing the arrival of Isabella Santos for the scheduled interview about the Morrison Holdings investigation. The transition from personal vulnerability to professional focus required the kind of mental compartmentalization that Maddie had perfected during her Wall Street years. Isabella entered the conference room with the confident bearing that had made her one of financial journalism's most respected voices. Her investigation of the Prometheus conspiracy had earned a Pulitzer Prize and triggered regulatory reforms that were still reshaping the investment banking industry. "Madison, thank you for making time for this follow-up interview," Isabella said, setting up recording equipment with practiced efficiency. "The Morrison Holdings case represents a fascinating evolution of the criminal enterprise you helped expose. Can you walk me through how prison-based money laundering operations work?" The technical aspects of financial crime provided safer ground than personal relationships, and Maddie found herself settling into the analytical mindset that had always been her professional strength. "Felix Morrison's operation demonstrates how sophisticated criminals adapt to incarceration," she explained, pulling up charts that illustrated the money laundering network Sarah had uncovered. "He's using legitimate investment vehicles, sustainable energy funds, environmental remediation projects, as fronts for laundering proceeds from continued illegal activities. The irony being that investors think they're supporting environmental protection while actually funding coal mining and illegal logging operations," Isabella observed. "Exactly. Morrison understands that ethical investing has become popular enough to provide cover for criminal activity. Investors don't scrutinize sustainable funds as carefully as traditional investments because they assume good intentions guarantee good outcomes." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering the technical complexities of prison-based financial crime and the regulatory gaps that enabled such operations. But as Isabella packed up her equipment, her questions took a more personal direction. "Madison, you've become something of a symbol for ethical finance reform. Do you feel pressure to be perfect, to avoid any mistakes that might discredit the movement you've come to represent?" The question touched on anxieties that had haunted Maddie since her congressional testimony transformed her from victim to advocate. The scrutiny that came with public prominence was intense and unforgiving. Any professional misstep would be interpreted as evidence that ethical finance was naive idealism rather than practical business strategy. "The pressure is real," she admitted. "But it's also clarifying. Knowing that people are watching every decision forces me to be absolutely honest about our motivations and methods. We can't afford to compromise our principles because doing so would discredit not just our firm, but the entire concept of ethical investing. Some critics argue that ethical finance is inherently limited, that global capitalism requires a certain level of moral flexibility to function effectively. How do you respond to that criticism?" Maddie considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would likely be quoted in articles that shaped public perception of their industry. "I think that criticism reflects a false choice between ethics and effectiveness," she replied. "Our experience suggests that transparent, stakeholder-focused business practices often generate better long-term results than strategies that prioritize short-term profit maximization at the expense of broader consequences. Can you give me a specific example? The renewable energy platform we're developing with Dmitry Volkov. Traditional investment banking would focus solely on financial returns for investors. Our approach includes community ownership components, workforce development programs, and environmental impact assessments that ensure local populations benefit from development rather than being exploited by it. And the financial performance? Exceeds projections by 30%, with substantially lower risk profiles than comparable traditional investments. It turns out that business models based on mutual benefit are more stable and profitable than extractive approaches. After Isabella left, Maddie found herself alone in the conference room, surrounded by charts and documents that told the story of their firm's evolution from idealistic experiment to practical demonstration of alternative business practices. The work was succeeding beyond her most optimistic projections, but success brought its own challenges. The secure phone buzzed with an encrypted call from an international number she didn't recognize. The voice that answered was heavily accented but spoke precise English. "Ms. Crawford? This is Dr. Chen Wei from the Beijing University Center for Sustainable Finance. I hope you will forgive the direct contact, but I have a proposal that may interest you." The unexpected call from an academic institution in China suggested opportunities that could expand their work into new geographic markets, but also complications that would require careful navigation of international political sensitivities. "Dr. Chen, I'm always interested in discussing sustainable finance initiatives. What kind of proposal are you considering?" The Chinese government is developing new regulatory frameworks for international environmental investing. They are seeking partnerships with Western firms that have established reputations for transparency and ethical practices. Your firm has been recommended as a potential consulting partner. The opportunity was simultaneously exciting and daunting. China's massive economy could provide the scale necessary to address global environmental challenges, but working with Chinese institutions would require navigating complex political and regulatory environments that could compromise their ethical standards. "Dr. Chen, that sounds like a fascinating opportunity, but it would require extensive due diligence to ensure our involvement wouldn't compromise our transparency commitments or enable activities that conflict with our ethical framework. Of course, we would not expect anything less from Crawford Sharma Ethical Finance. Perhaps we could arrange a preliminary meeting to discuss possibilities and address concerns?" After ending the call, Maddie realized that their firm had reached an inflection point. The success of their ethical approach was generating opportunities for expansion that could either validate their model on a global scale or dilute their principles through the complexities of international business. As evening approached, the office gradually emptied except for the core team that had built Crawford Sharma Ethical Finance from idealistic concept to functioning alternative to traditional investment banking. Priya was reviewing environmental impact assessments for their latest renewable energy project. Sarah was monitoring international markets for signs of criminal activity that might require investigation, and James was structuring the Scottish wine farm partnership that would expand their European operations. "Team meeting," Maddie announced, gathering everyone in the conference room for the kind of strategic discussion that had become their weekly ritual. "We need to talk about scaling up and the risks that come with success." The conversation that followed addressed the fundamental challenges facing any organization that tried to maintain ethical standards while growing large enough to create systemic change. Each new opportunity, the Russian wind farms, the Chinese regulatory consulting, the expanding European partnerships, required careful evaluation to ensure growth didn't compromise the principles that defined their identity. The question, Priya observed during their discussion, is whether we're trying to build a successful business that happens to be ethical, or an ethical movement that uses business as a tool for social change. "Why can't it be both?" Sarah asked from her laptop, where she was monitoring real-time market data for suspicious patterns that might indicate criminal activity. Because those goals sometimes conflict, James replied thoughtfully. Business. Success requires compromises, efficiency improvements, and strategic decisions that might not align perfectly with idealistic ethical standards. The tension he'd identified was real and unavoidable. Pure ethical standards could limit growth. Opportunities, but compromising principles for expansion risked becoming just another investment bank with better marketing. I think our approach has to be evolutionary, Maddie decided. We maintain our core ethical framework as non-negotiable, but we adapt our methods as we learn more about what works at different scales of operation. And if we reach a point where maintaining our principles limits our ability to address the problems we're trying to solve, Priya pressed, then I think I've been so focused on protecting myself from another betrayal that I've missed the evidence that's been building for months about who you actually are. What evidence? The way you walked away from Morgan Hartley's partnership? Tracked to join an experimental firm with no guaranteed future. The way you've prioritized our clients' interests even when it meant lower compensation for yourself. The way you've supported my leadership without trying to compete for credit or control. She moved closer to him, feeling the nervous energy that had characterized their relationship since their reunion in Singapore. I think I'm ready to trust my judgment about your character, because the evidence supports what my heart has been telling me for months. The kiss that followed was different from their brief romantic involvement 5 years earlier. Less desperate, more thoughtful, grounded in mutual respect rather than competitive attraction. So, James said when they separated, does this mean we're adding relationship counseling to our list of challenges alongside international finance reform? I think it means we're building something together that's bigger than either career success or personal happiness alone, Maddie replied. Something that honors both our professional ambitions and our capacity for trust. As they left the office together, walking through Manhattan's financial district toward the modest apartment Maddie had chosen over the luxury accommodations her Blackstone salary had once afforded, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from building a life aligned with personal values. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, had not only survived betrayal and rebuilt her career, she'd created a model for business practices that proved integrity and success were not mutually exclusive. The work ahead would be challenging, complex, and fraught with opportunities for both triumph and failure. But for the first time since receiving that devastating phone call over the Atlantic 18 months earlier, Maddie Crawford felt confident that she was building something worth protecting, something that would endure beyond the ambitions and betrayals that had once defined her understanding of success. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape according to principles learned in Kentucky mountains and refined through trials that had tested every aspect of her character. And she was no longer facing that future alone. 2 years after the collapse of the Prometheus conspiracy, Madison Crawford stood on the observation deck of the Shanghai World Financial Center, watching the city's impossible skyline stretch toward a horizon painted in shades of amber and rose. The view from the 91st floor encompassed a metropolis that embodied both the promise and peril of global capitalism. Gleaming towers that housed trillion-dollar enterprises rising above neighborhoods where millions struggled for economic survival. The irony of her location wasn't lost on her. Shanghai had become the epicenter of China's financial modernization, a city where ancient traditions of commerce intersected with cutting-edge technology and international capital flows. It was also where Crawford Sharma ethical finance would either prove that principled business practices could operate at global scale, or discover that their idealistic model couldn't survive the complexities of international politics and cultural differences. The preliminary due diligence reports are more encouraging than I expected. Dr. Chen Wei's voice carried across the private conference room that overlooked the city's financial district. The Beijing University professor had spent 6 months evaluating their firm's methodology, and his assessment would determine whether their partnership with Chinese institutions could move forward. Maddie turned from the window to study the assembled team that represented 2 years of careful relationship building. Dr. Chen's academic credibility provided intellectual foundation for their collaboration, while representatives from China's sovereign wealth fund offered the capital resources necessary for projects that could address environmental challenges at continental scale. But the most significant presence in the room was Liu Xiaoping, Deputy Director of China's National Development and Reform Commission, whose approval would be required for any foreign partnership involving strategic environmental investments. Her evaluation of Crawford Sharma's ethical framework would determine whether their model could bridge the cultural and political gaps that had historically limited international cooperation on climate issues. Ms. Crawford, Director Liu's English was precise and formal, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of millions of people. Your firm's approach to stakeholder capitalism is intriguing, but we must understand how these principles would apply to projects involving state-directed economic planning. The question struck at the heart of their expansion challenge. Crawford Sharma's success in Western markets had been built on transparency, community involvement, and decentralized decision-making that reflected democratic values. Adapting those principles to China's more centralized economic system would require philosophical flexibility that might compromise their core identity. Director Liu, our fundamental principle is that sustainable development requires the participation and benefit of all stakeholders, Maddie replied carefully. In different political systems, the mechanisms for achieving that participation may vary, but the underlying commitment to mutual benefit remains constant. Can you provide a specific example of how this might work in practice? Maddie activated the room's presentation system, displaying detailed plans for their proposed renewable energy platform in Xinjiang province. The project represented everything complex about international ethical finance, massive environmental benefits that could accelerate global climate goals, but implementation in a region where human rights concerns created ethical complications. The Xinjiang renewable platform would generate enough clean energy to power 12 million homes while creating approximately 40,000 permanent jobs, she explained, highlighting economic projections that demonstrated the project's financial viability. But our participation would require independent monitoring of labor practices, community consultation processes, and transparent reporting that meets international human rights standards. The silence that followed her presentation was heavy with calculation. Director Liu studied the environmental impact assessments while Dr. Chen reviewed the economic modeling that projected 20-year returns exceeding 15% annually. But underlying their technical evaluation was a political question that couldn't be answered through financial analysis. Ms. Crawford, Director Liu said finally, your conditions for participation essentially require China to accept foreign oversight of domestic development projects. Why should we agree to such arrangements when we could structure similar projects without external monitoring? The directness of her challenge was both refreshing and daunting. This was the moment when Crawford Sharma's principles would either prove their value in international negotiations or reveal themselves as naive idealism that couldn't survive contact with geopolitical reality. Because independent monitoring provides credibility that increases the project's value to all participants, Maddie replied with the confidence that had carried her through congressional testimony and regulatory hearings. International investors, partner governments, and environmental organizations all require assurance that development projects meet standards for human rights and environmental protection. Our monitoring framework isn't foreign oversight, it's quality assurance that makes large-scale international cooperation possible. Dr. Chen leaned forward, his academic perspective adding nuance to the political discussion. Director Liu, the global trend toward ESG investing means that projects without credible ethical frameworks face increasing difficulty accessing international capital markets. Ms. Crawford's conditions may seem restrictive, but they actually expand our access to funding sources that would otherwise be unavailable. The economic argument carried weight that pure ethical appeals might not have achieved. China's development goals required massive capital investments that domestic resources alone couldn't provide. International funding for renewable energy projects had become contingent on transparency standards that reflected global rather than national priorities. "Very well," Director Liu said after long moments of consideration. "We are prepared to discuss pilot projects that could demonstrate the viability of your monitoring framework, but such arrangements would require reciprocal transparency from your firm about funding sources, decision-making processes, and potential conflicts of interest." The demand for reciprocal transparency was reasonable and expected, but it would require disclosure of information that could compromise some of their Western clients' competitive positions. Balancing Chinese requirements for transparency with American and European expectations of confidentiality would require legal and diplomatic sophistication that pushed their firm into uncharted territory. "We accept the principle of reciprocal transparency," Maddie agreed, "subject to review of specific disclosure requirements to ensure protection of legitimate commercial confidentiality for all parties involved." The preliminary agreement established a framework for negotiations that would either expand their model to global scale or reveal the practical limits of ethical, facilitated by renewable energy development. Such cooperation would require political commitments that extend far beyond commercial arrangements. "Yes, sir," Priya replied without hesitation, "because the challenges we're addressing, climate change, energy poverty, technological development, are too large for any single country to solve independently. The solutions require the kind of continental cooperation that has historically been prevented by extractive investment models." The silence that followed her statement was heavy with political calculation. What Crawford Sharma was proposing wasn't just a business deal. It was a model for African self-determination that could fundamentally alter the continent's relationship with global economic systems. "Ms. Crawford," President Adebayo said finally, "assuming we were to support such an initiative, what guarantees do you offer that this project will not suffer the same fate as previous international investments that promised transformation, but delivered exploitation?" The question went to the heart of their credibility challenge. How could they convince African leaders that their intentions were genuine when decades of experience had taught those leaders to be skeptical of foreign promises? "Mr. President, we offer transparency standards that exceed anything previously implemented in international development finance," Maddie replied, displaying monitoring frameworks that had been refined through 2 years of global project management, independent oversight by African institutions, real-time reporting of all financial flows, and community participation requirements that ensure local populations benefit directly from development activities. "Furthermore," James added, "our firm's compensation is structured to align with long-term project success rather than short-term deal completion. We profit only when participating communities achieve measurable improvements in income, education, and infrastructure development." The alignment of financial incentives with social outcomes represented a fundamental departure from traditional investment banking, where fees were collected regardless of projects' ultimate impact on local populations. "And your opponents?" President Adebayo asked, with the directness that had characterized Nigeria's approach to international relations under his leadership. "We are aware that your firm is under systematic attack by institutions with resources that exceed many national governments. How do you propose to complete this project while under such pressure?" The acknowledgement of their opposition was both sobering and clarifying. African leaders understood economic warfare better than most, having navigated decades of pressure, from institutions that used financial manipulation to enforce political compliance. "Mr. President, our opponents possess significant resources, but they also have vulnerabilities," Maddie replied with the strategic confidence that had carried her through months of systematic assault. "Their business models depend on maintaining current systems that extract wealth from developing countries while providing minimal local benefit. A successful African renewable platform would demonstrate alternatives that threaten their fundamental approach to international investment. Which means, President Adebayo observed with growing interest, that our success becomes your defense against their attacks. Exactly. By demonstrating that ethical finance can deliver outcomes that traditional models cannot achieve, we make ourselves indispensable rather than just competitive. The strategic logic was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than defending against attacks, they would make their success essential to addressing problems that their opponents couldn't solve. African energy poverty represented exactly the kind of challenge where ethical finance's stakeholder-focused approach could deliver results that pure profit maximization had failed to achieve for decades. Very well, President Adebayo decided after consultation with his advisors in Rapid Yoruba. Nigeria will participate in your renewable platform, subject to agreements that protect our sovereignty and ensure our populations receive measurable benefits from development activities. The commitment from Nigeria, Africa's largest economy and most influential nation, would provide the foundation needed to build broader continental cooperation. But it also marked the point where their theoretical project became an actual construction challenge requiring coordination across multiple countries while under sustained attack from some of the world's most powerful institutions. As the meeting concluded with commitments to continue technical negotiations, Maddie felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that had characterized every major milestone in their firm's evolution. But this time, the stakes extended far beyond their business success to encompass the future of international development finance and Africa's position in global economic systems. The flight back to New York provided opportunity for reflection on what they had committed themselves to attempting. $50 billion in renewable energy development across 12 countries, creating 2 million jobs while demonstrating that ethical finance could address civilization-scale challenges, all while under systematic attack from opponents with virtually unlimited resources and institutional connections. "Penny for your thoughts," James said, settling into the seat beside her in Dimitri's private jet as they crossed the Atlantic toward whatever new crisis awaited their return to Manhattan. "I'm thinking about my grandmother," Maddie replied, surprising herself with the admission. "About what she'd say if she could see what we're trying to accomplish." "What do you think she'd say?" "Probably something about not getting too big for my britches," Maddie smiled, remembering Eleanor Crawford's characteristic directness. "But also something about the difference between doing what's easy and doing what's necessary." The wisdom of those Appalachian mountains felt relevant to the challenges ahead. Building transformational projects while under systematic opposition would require the same kind of stubborn determination that had carried her family through generations of economic hardship and social exclusion. The girl from Hazard, Kentucky, was about to attempt something that could change the world or destroy everything she'd built trying. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.